There's a reason behind every large decision and choice that Capcom makes. This goes double when you take the future of Resident Evil under advisement. Along with the notion of getting countless modernized remakes, we're also taking a peek under the hood for the future. They could potentially close the book on the older cast members from a storyline perspective. Every beginning has an end because we have to deal with the notion that Resident Evil 9 will probably end some ongoing storylines. Why am I making this ultimate notion when nothing is really set in stone? Well, it's been alluded to numerous times that the characters that we all know and love are getting older in the Resident Evil mythos. Leon S. Kennedy, Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Claire Redfield, Rebecca Chambers, etc. The list goes on and on. Our intrepid heroes all witnessed some form of nasty BOWs throughout the years. Leon in particular audibly questioned this path to Chris Redfield in Resident Evil Vendetta. It's a piece of dialogue that is readily important because it's one of the few moments that someone decides to ask, when is it going to end? Is there ever going to be peace? Are we going to keep fighting forever?
We got the bad guys. Hope we made the world a little safer.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah?
How much longer can we keep going on like this?
I don't know. I never make plans that far ahead.
Capcom has toyed with various ideas that range from potential scenarios like killing off set characters like Leon or Chris. I think the reason they haven't done this were equivalent to last-minute decisions. These teams didn't want to part ways with these characters just as much as the people didn't. Even if I could argue that Resident Evil 6 would have been a more symbolic ending had Chris Redfield died, because let's be honest, the torch was going to be passed to Pearson Evans anyway. A retirement or death has Chris's name written all over it in that game. Then there's the official statement given by the company itself, illusions that might trigger for Resident Evil 9. Capcom knows that there's many lingering plot threads that remain unresolved to this day when you regard current lore. I mean, Alex Wesker is still pretty much digitized into the mind of a child, and she's living with one of the major characters in the series, Barry Burton. I will come back to this a little bit some other time, but right now everything about Resident Evil 9 is a big slice of rumors, so I'm only stitching together my reasoning behind the 16-year time skip from a logical perspective. Speculation will still be rampant upon making this video, so don't yell at me too hard in the comment section if things end up being largely unproven. This is just my theories and speculation for why they did this whole jump into the future with the 16-year time gap in Resident Evil Village for the epilogue. The first thing we must ask ourselves is why? Why did Capcom decide to skip 16 years into the future with Resident Evil Village? This leaves a significant gap in the overall timeline for this remarkable franchise. 16 years only creates more questions than normal, which I think is part of the intrigue here. You want to know exactly what happened in this long period of time, this long significant portion of time. It really equates to all the intrigue about the characters, the previous established history, and knowing new characters in the process. What exactly happened during this time? Whether you like it or not, you're already invested into the story for Resident Evil 9 because they basically established this entire time jump. We don't know jack and shit of what happened to everybody else in 2037. We got a basic conclusion for the story of Ethan and Rose Winters, which closed the chapter on their saga. I think Rose Winters will still be involved in some fashion if they go forward with this 2037 timeline. However, I think Capcom did mean it when they said that the story for the Winters' family is over. Rose will probably be a side character, but not the main focus as she was in the DLC with her story and everything for Resident Evil Village. At best, it's easy to assume that RE9 will be told in a non-linear perspective, which will involve flashbacks galore. The reason for this is because of something that happened in Death Island recently. It's the idea that Jill Valentine is returning strong as a character after a large absence of years, with her not being active in the timeline. They also said in a recent interview that the virus in Jill's body, the antibodies being pumped out, is an excuse for her to not really look old. Therefore, I think she's gonna be, it's equivalent to that meme that I saw on Reddit where it's like Chris was the only older character significantly aged because he never had any sort of viral injections that he had to combat and try to get rid of, compared to most characters who were infected, who had plagas in their bloodstream. So now this is the convenient excuse of writing where it's like, oh, we can keep her a little bit aged up because of this. And I think that's kind of funny, but besides the point. Either way, I'm sure we need to understand Jill's opinion on BSAA North America, who is now turning into a rogue contractor of sorts after an affected BSAA member nearly assassinated Chris Redfield. Remember guys, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine are more or less founding members of the BSAA, so one of them almost got killed. Who was the mole that set them up? We need to realize, understand, and come to some sort of resolution on that storyline. I'm sure unwilling infected individuals being prepped for war and who can you trust as a storyline will be at the forefront for Resident Evil 9. It will be talking about biological infections and people that possibly seem normal and can control it, and those willingly giving up their bodies to fight as a BOW on the battlefield might be part of the talking point, the politics of RE9, since some of the concept art of Village and some of the illusions and art that we've seen there shows that there was going to be a large-scale battle involving members of the BSA, people that were infected, and that was cut out of RE Village. I wouldn't be surprised if Capcom tries to recycle that idea for Resident Evil 9, and then there is a large-scale fight with humans that are infected, willing soldiers that are infected with certain DNA and viruses and all that scary shit. And then we see there's another rumor floating around that Capcom wants to focus on the idea of isolated incidents when RE9 wraps up. Personally speaking, I think that's a great idea, even if I take this with a grain of salt. Remember when I said that Capcom knows there's many lingering plot threads that remain unresolved to this day regarding lore for the Resident Evil franchise. Isolated incidents will wipe the slate clean. You don't have to necessarily worry about grandiose bioterrorism stories with all these factions roped in like ex-Umbrella members or DSO or BSA. An isolated incident could be as simple as one man fights an entire mob of Louisiana nutjobs, which is exactly already focal to Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Ethan's first outing was a soft reboot, either way you look at it. If they focus on isolated incidents, then not only can you milk older characters moving backward in the timeline, but you can also milk new character stories going forward and have the journey unfold from there. This allows Capcom to deliver and adjust whatever story baggage they see fit involving large-scale or small-scale biological outbreaks. We could go from a small prison infected with zombies to something large scale that Leon or Chris is dealing with in the past with this 16-year time gap. That could be a game, a movie, anything going forward from here as they focus on what happened in the years followed. Honestly, if we're being frank, I don't think every burning storyline detail, every question in the flashbacks for RE9, if they do them, will be answered. I think we're gonna get somewhat of a portion, but not the full exact picture of everyone for these events. I think there's going to be prequels, sequels to those stories that will occur with those 16 years. That's why I think you can milk the timeline with the older characters, even if RE9 has significant flashbacks. There's also the premise that Capcom has done in situations like this before, where they made a change that created more stories in the timeline, whether it was the timeline moving forward or backwards. Let's take an example of Resident Evil 5 even existing. Chris goes to Kijuju and he mentions that biological warfare has become this big business at this point, where viruses are now sold and redistributed for the highest bidder. Albert Wesker was one of the sellers who added to the black market distribution for reselling viruses. This meant that evil went global, and it made sense because the outbreaks started to become more prominent in the timeline at any point in the world. Wesker was riding high at this point, and the storyline decision to do that still happened. They did it because it was a safety net to explain any future villain or outbreak going forward, because Wesker ultimately died in Resident Evil 5. Resident Evil 6 is a large-scale result of new viruses cropping up all over the place, which allowed the story to continue onward. The time jump is also a reason for the greater Resident Evil story to continue when you really think about it. The final part just correlates to some burning questions that I really don't have the answers for at this point in time. I'll try pondering a few of them just in case. That means you can get the general gist from there. Number one, what happened to the idea of Blue Umbrella? How prominent are they in this timeline? People thought that Blue Umbrella was going to be an evil PMC, private military contractor. They're saying that they are fighting for the greater good. They want to right the wrongs of the Umbrella name and try to do a new legacy with helping and being for the greater good. But even Chris Redfield questioned this logic. Are they still good after the BSA heel turn? What happened to the mole in the BSAA who tried to have Chris Redfield killed off? What happened to the crime syndicate called the Connections, who were tied to Wesker's Hive Host capture force? What happened to Brandon Bailey when the BSA said that he potentially might not be dead? For reference here, Brandon Bailey is one of the prominent members within the Connections. What happened to the family, a faction that was connected to Derek C. Simmons in Resident Evil 6? They implied that he could be moved on from in that very game alone. Natalia Corda still has Alex Wesker digitized in her tiny little mind. So what happened there? Did Alex Wesker become the first being to discover an immortal virus, and did she continue onward with their work from there, as alluded to in Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil Revelations 2? What kind of games or movies was filled in during this 16-year time jump from 2021 to 2037? There is a huge pool of content they could do with this 16-year time jump in Resident Evil. Did any of the previous heroes have any children during this time in the Resident Evil timeline? Are there any characters who died off screen after fighting so many biological weapons? Has there been a drastic change in someone's personality after the entirety of 16 years? What are the character motivations and relationships in 2037? All we know is that Chris still treats Rose like a surrogate daughter, and that's it. What biological outbreaks impacted the world during this time? All we know is that it doesn't seem like there is this post-apocalyptic scenario that the movies wanted to believe. Everything seems clean and normal. Yet that doesn't mean that there hasn't been war, there hasn't been cities that went under, there hasn't been massive death tolls in the process. There's still a lot to uncover in that regard, even though everything looks like a peaceful and living environment when we see Rose's portion. We didn't see the entire world events within the 16-year time jump. Let's see, what else do we have here? How many viruses were created during this time gap? It has to be a lot more, since there are scientists who experiment, people that are smart, people that mix and match viruses all the time, and all of them are in the black market. Evil exists almost everywhere, so it's easy to ask what type of bad guys and viruses cropped up during this 16-year time jump as well. There's a lot of questions and a lot to be answered. I hope Resident Evil 9 fulfills that with the rumored 2025 release date. I hope this is the biggest game in the FPS trilogy that caps off a successful run for first-person horror. Then we can finally move into a future worth fighting for, worth caring for, and worth going to hell for.
More and more, I find myself wondering if it's all worth fighting for. For a future without fear? Yeah, it's worth it.